Thank you all for joining us for our SICSS-Howard Mathematica Lunchtime Talk with Dr. Mark Duerksen from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. During these chats while you chew, you'll meet interesting people or organizations that are doing cool and complementary work to what you're learning about at the Summer Institute at Howard. If you don't have your lunch yet, hit pause. For those of you with food and beverage in hand, let's get started.
Thank you, Nanette, and thanks for inviting me to speak with the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science at Howard. It's a great honor to be here. And as Nanette mentioned, I'm a researcher at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C., focusing on disinformation and urbanization trends. My fieldwork has primarily been in Nigeria. I spent a lot of time in the mega city of Lagos on the coast, and also next door in Benin. So I'll actually be in Kenya during the Q&A session for this talk, doing additional research on disinformation in the upcoming August presidential election there. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. What I'm going to talk about today is the rise of online disinformation across the African continent and what we know about these attempts to spread false information. So here's a roadmap of what I'll plan to cover in the next 30 minutes. First, I'll go over what I mean by disinformation, some of the debates around it, and why disinformation in Africa matters. Second, I'll introduce our current data set on detected and documented cases of disinformation in Africa. And third, I'll review what the data shows us about the scale of the problem, the countries that are impacted, the actors behind these attacks, a little bit about their objectives and tactics, and what impact these campaigns have had. Finally, I'll briefly mention what can be done to mitigate disinformation in Africa and talk about some of the policy responses available and what remains to be researched and developed. So what is disinformation? It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. And there's a lot of misconceptions about what we're talking about when we talk about disinformation. And it gets thrown around a lot as a major problem that's affecting our information and political landscapes. And so one key distinction is differentiating between misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is false information that is spread regardless of intent to mislead. So an easy way to remember this is to think about the prefix mis and just think about mistake. It's not intentional. It's someone not realizing that something's inaccurate or fake news and clicking the share button, clicking the like button, amplifying that content. But it's not really a intentional strategy. Whereas disinformation is the intentional dissemination of false information for the purpose of advancing a political or economic objective. So that the prefix dis means the opposite of something. So it's reverse information or anti-information, specifically created to deceive and misguide people or a network of people. And what our concern and our focus is at the Africa Center is primarily on large-scale disinformation campaigns in online social media spaces. So we're looking at networks working in coordination to intentionally spread fake information to mask the identity of their accounts and or to artificially boost the online reach of the content they're spreading. So another question is, does disinformation matter? Is it worth the time to study it, to understand it, and combat it? And there's a somewhat popular argument at the moment that the concern over disinformation is overblown. And people who are advancing this argument claim that focusing on disinformation neglects underlying issues and drivers of unrest. That really we're not talking about. We're talking about the symptoms, not the root causes of issues when we talk about disinformation. And there's a lot of different strands of this argument, but a common refrain is that there has always been disinformation. Whether it's intentional rumors that are spread, whether it's state propaganda spread through radio, television, or print media, that these forms of intentionally false narratives have always been created and disseminated. And this is true. This is the intentional and calculated spread of false information. It really is nothing new. But what has changed, and in the analysis of many information experts, is the medium. That is online social media platforms and how they connect networks of people to information, through which false information can then be spread, and then the asymmetrical advantages this medium has created for individuals or countries aiming to spread disruptive and divisive content. So over centuries, in recent decades, societies and countries have developed guardrails, policies, laws, best practices, norms, albeit often imperfect, for combating and curbing disinformation campaigns in traditional media. And so what we're raising the red flag about is that those guardrails, those policies, those laws are not currently in place for online social media information systems. And so those systems, those platforms, that's what we call the digital disinformation gap, that there is currently still this open attack surface for actors seeking to spread intentionally false information online. So just a little bit of very briefly, kind of the history of the opening of this digital disinformation gap is traced back by scholars to the early 2010s or a little bit before. And it really was a tactic that was developed and deployed by Russian military planners, especially around the Russian invasion of the first invasion of Eastern Ukraine in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And so these military planners saw that these online spaces, that they could flood them with disinformation campaigns, that they could mask their identity, could put out narratives that either confused what was actually happening or push pro-Russian narratives, and really just confuse the conversation around what was happening, and lead to a stalling of a political will to do something. So really the purpose was inaction and confusion. So disinformation has changed and it does matter. And it's important to remember that it's really, it is only part of the issue. It's often disinformation exploits and targets social media platforms, but it does tap into real underlying social, political, economic tensions and instability around the world. So kind of the way of looking at it from this perspective is a tactic that's deployed as a catalyst and an accelerant. It's used to manipulate and direct social and political unrest and movements towards specific ends. And I'll come back to these campaigns, the impact of these campaigns towards the end of this presentation. But what is important to know is that they are working and delivering results to their sponsors. And that's why we continue to see an acceleration of their use in Africa and the proliferation of them. So one example of how disinformation matters comes from the African continent is Libya, which, as you'll see in a moment, is the first country where these campaigns were detected as being deployed on a large scale and documented there. And so we've published a Q&A with a Libyan expert who has lived in the country on and off for decades, who has seen the information environment in Libya change. And so she describes how as several international powers began pumping in intentionally false information onto Libya's social media spaces after the fall of Gaddafi in the beginning of the Libyan civil war, good information became almost impossible to find in the country. At first people were really excited about social media, about connecting with people, about having conversations. There was a lot of talk about a political dialogue happening on social media. But as thousands of fake accounts popped up, as thousands of fake posts were spread and amplified by other fake accounts, the information environment became really toxic, and people began to disengage with those conversations, began to disengage with politics, and kind of, as she describes it, become siloed in their own networks, which has made it really difficult for there to be, as there's been these different attempts at dialogue between the two sides in the Libyan civil war, to have any kind of traction in the political process, because people there see the country through such different social media lenses and such different information environments that even really the most basic facts can't be agreed on. So next I'll talk about kind of the bigger picture and what we know about the state of disinformation in Africa. So the Africa Center, we recently published a report on disinformation campaigns in Africa, and we looked at every detected and documented case we could find. So our methodology was nothing too sophisticated or complicated. Really, we were just one of the few organizations paying attention to what was happening and continually paying attention for several years, and really just following the literature, following every case we could find, and then aggregating it really just into this large spreadsheet, and looking at countries targeted, the years the campaign started, key actors, their objectives, their tactics, and what we could assess about the impact of each campaign. So we've documented 50 campaigns of various size and sophistication, going back to the Libya example in 2014, when there was evidence of fake pages and fake accounts being created on Facebook there. And then, as you'll see, you can use this link and go to our website and see the full report, the full data set. But there's been an intensification of these campaigns in the last few years, really starting around 2018, 2019. And then several of these campaigns are ongoing. They have not been removed yet. And as their tactics have become more sophisticated, social media companies have been reluctant to remove some of these coordinated disinformation efforts. So some of the organizations that we follow and that we've been in touch with and are working with are the Atlantic Council's DFR lab. They've dug into a lot of these campaigns in partnership with Facebook and Twitter. Likewise, the Stanford Internet Observatory has partnered with Facebook to kind of look behind the hood and see some of the data once these campaigns have been detected, and then to publish these publicly available reports on various campaigns. And then another organization doing this work is the Mozilla Foundation. So those are three organizations to follow as more of these campaigns come to light. In total, the campaigns that we are aware of that have been detected have targeted 28 of 54 African countries, though some of these campaigns have been directed intentionally at a broader, more Pan-African audience and not confined to one social media space. They've targeted a diverse group of African countries. As you can see on this map, really every region of the continent has been the subject of these campaigns. And then on this map, you can see the countries that have been targeted 3 or more times, 2 times, or just a single time that we're aware of. So the countries that have been targeted 7 times include large media markets like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, as well as several countries undergoing political transitions between democracy and authoritarianism, or in either direction. And so those would be Libya, Mali, and Sudan. Again, the countries that have 2 documented campaigns are several large media markets, like Ghana, Tunisia, the DRC, and then also countries undergoing transitions. Again, Tunisia, CAR, or the DRC. So one thing to note about this data set is that it's inherently incomplete. Disinformation campaigns are intended to be covert. They're intended to be undetectable in trying to hide who's behind them. And really, the goal is for them to appear as authentic content, as authentic social movements, pushing these certain narratives. And there's a quote that's stuck with me from a researcher I've worked closely with, whose name is Tessa Knight. She's a South African research for the DFR lab. And so she said that every time she set out to search for coordinated disinformation in advance of an election or around conflicts, she's found it. She has not investigated an online space in Africa and not found disinformation. So this, I think, really puts into perspective that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. This is what has been detected and publicly documented. So that's important to keep in mind. So the other thing that we're tracking is who's behind these campaigns. That's a key part of the equation. And as you can see on this map, one foreign country that has been particularly active has been Russia in sponsoring these campaigns in every region of the continent. So we're aware of Russian disinformation campaigns targeting 18 African countries. And then we have documented domestic African political or economic actors tied to 14 campaigns, Middle Eastern countries, so the UAE, Israel, Saudi Arabia, connected to campaigns targeting 14 countries. And then this example at the bottom of Chinese disinformation, really it's one kind of large ongoing campaign that operates through Chinese embassies and diplomats, and then a large army of fake bot accounts to amplify Russian state or Chinese state media disinformation. And so the timeline of these actors that have been active in the continent, there were fake pages, fake accounts cropping up connected to foreign actors in Libya. In the mid 2010s, there was a PR firm that was basically dabbling in disinformation in South Africa. All right, sorry about that. Had an attack of the barking dog. So where I think I was talking about some of these actors who are behind these disinformation campaigns in Africa. And kind of the timeline of it has been really that, as I mentioned earlier, that around 2018, 2019, Russian campaigns really started to intensify. So here we can see this 2018 group of campaigns targeting Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, the DRC, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Sudan. And each of these were separate campaigns, but all connected to an individual named Prigozhin, who was previously Putin's personal chef, and then got government contracts and became kind of the shadowy figure behind a group or a collection of groups known as Wagner. And these are a mercenary outfit that have been present in a little bit more than a dozen African countries. And they've been connected to a lot of these Russian disinformation campaigns. So these mercenaries have been connected to Prigozhin, and then he's been connected to the creation and dissemination of disinformation in countries where Russian mercenaries are operating. And what these campaigns have done, kind of their objective, as far as we can tell from our analysis, is to cheerlead Russian backed candidates or ruling party candidates, to fan anti-French sentiment, and then really just to champion Russia and Russian interest. And these campaigns are ongoing. These 2018 network was taken down. This 2022 network is much larger. It's targeting really, it's been a global campaign around Russia's invasion of Ukraine to spread pro-Kremlin narratives around that invasion. And then especially in Africa, to kind of drum up the appearance of global support amongst African countries, especially around the UN vote to condemn the invasion, and kind of pushing the narrative that there's an African popular support for the invasion, and that African countries should either abstain from that vote or vote not to condemn Russia. And so really the bigger objective behind these campaigns is part of what's been called Russia's return to Africa. And this has been a concerted effort in the past 5, 6, 7 years to really reestablish or to establish ties with African countries, like there was during the era of the USSR and the Soviet connections with quite a few African countries. But this kind of the vision behind this, these connections and these relationships has really been, as we've described in some of our work, really about a form of opportunism. And the countries that Russia has had particularly strong engagement with have typically been autocratic countries where there is an isolated or a weak regime that Russian diplomats, Russian engagements have focused on in making deals directly with elites in those regimes around arms deals, mineral deals, mining deals, and then providing these Wagner mercenaries to those countries, primarily, to secure mining interests, to secure the regime in place, or to put down, rebellions or revolts. So it's really been a form of the security assistance that has been documented there has really been more about regime security than any kind of national or citizen security. And so, as these quotes show, kind of what this return to Russia has meant for, or return to Africa has meant for Russia, has been a way to, there's been a strategic side to it in terms of these deals for enriching elites in Russia, in Africa, but there's also been a political, ideological opportunism to it in advancing Putin's vision for a post-liberal international order. And this is, so the disinformation campaigns have, spread false narratives around what Russia is doing in these countries. And then it has really tried to drum up support for, Russia bringing mercenaries for these mining operations. And then it's also mounted this broader messaging effort, really disparaging democracy, because kind of this whole model of Russian engagement in Africa has been around direct relationships with elites of autocratic regimes. And so this messaging revolves around democracy's ineffectiveness and weakness, the futility of supporting any candidate, and then kind of this idea that there's a trade-off between democracy and security. So this has been kind of the focus of these disinformation campaigns and the objective behind them. Kind of in any scenario, kind of a useful term is thinking about is what we call anti-communication. So while these campaigns are pushing very direct messages, cheerleading certain candidates or promoting Russian mercenaries or Russian commercial interest in a country, they're also just kind of more generally disparaging democracy, disparaging efforts for democratic reform, for civil society efforts to curb third terms of presidents, so that kind of thing. And so this term anti-communication is the active opposition to any effort to engage in constructive communication, which I think is just a good way of thinking about kind of the broader purpose of pumping disinformation into these environments, is really not necessarily to drive the conversation one way, but to muddle the conversation so much that it becomes difficult for anyone to, for there to be any kind of active, productive dialogue, especially around democracy or democratic reforms. So some of the other objectives, what we've documented is after this initial barrage of Russian campaigns, a number of domestic actors started to develop their own sophisticated disinformation campaigns and deploying them in a number of African countries, especially around political objectives. And so much less of this has been kind of disparaging democracy generally or kind of polluting the information environment as, going after specific opponents or promoting a specific candidate through these inauthentic coordinated campaigns. So in Guinea, in the lead up to the 2020 election, the incumbent Alpha Conde, the president there was this network connected to his political party, and they really just flooded Facebook with pro-Conde messaging in the lead up to the election and around his controversial bid for a third term, and made it was very unclear, that these accounts were actually sponsored by the ruling party. Many of them were fake. And then several of the administrators of those pages were in Turkey. And then another example in Kenya in 2021, there was a really high profile Supreme Court, high court case around a constitutional amendment. And there was a very active Twitter campaign trying to tarnish the reputation and competence of the high court, trying to discredit certain journalists and activists, and then, another part of this was the Pandora Papers came out, and the same network was operationalized to distort public opinion and interpretation of what the Pandora Papers meant. And so what we've also seen is over the last few years is that the tactics by these organizers of these campaigns have become increasingly sophisticated and really good at evading detection. So there was the 2018 group of Russian campaigns that were pretty easy once people started noticing them and started looking, realizing that Africa had become a new target for these kind of campaigns. They're relatively easy to uncover and to flag for Facebook or Twitter and have them taken down because oftentimes their administrators were based in Russia or Eastern Europe. And so some of Facebook's transparency features would show on a page that this page is claiming to be in Sudan or the Central African Republic, but all the administrators are in Russia. So that's a pretty obvious red flag. And then Facebook would dig into it and then provide the data that, oh yeah, these pages all, these profiles all seem to be fake. They're spreading this coordinated these messages at the same time. We can see the spikes in activities. Okay, we'll take them down. So that started to get a little bit more sophisticated when the Wagner group seemed to start contracting or what's been termed franchising posting operations to people in country. So there's for example, was a network of pages in Sudan that were operated in Sudan, but also clearly had connections to Russian disinformation. Facebook was able to determine that they were actually engaging in disinformation because they were still creating fake pages, duplicate pages, and pumping out these messages, but trying to cloak that by having these operations franchised in country to people who had a better sense of the language, of the local conversations, and what kinds of false narratives might resonate with people there. So more recently, there seems to have been an effort to really intensify this franchising model and to pay or sponsor influencers across the African continent to spread messages that come directly from Russian state media outlets. So Russia Today and Sputnik, which have now been banned in the European Union because they've been determined to be part of Russia's war machine. But in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine this year, RT, Russia Today, registered multiple new African domain names and set up editorial offices in Nairobi, Kenya. And so this is kind of been seen as a new model of disinformation, is really to invest in influencers in African countries, to recruit them, to instruct them, to finance them, to provide them with these central state-directed messages. And it's really proved to be paralyzing for social media companies because it's a very effective way of blurring the line, the established lines between what was previously pretty clear-cut, inauthentic, coordinated content, and now what is these are real people posting from their own accounts, yet it's still part of this centralized effort to undermine political processes and political dialogue in places undergoing transitions like Mali, like Sudan, like Libya. So that's where things stand at the moment. Just to step back, you can take some time to go through this chart where we list all the different tactics. But this is another example from Kenya where kind of domestic actors are innovating on this front. So there it's become a trend for, this is actually pretty interesting case because this campaign around the Building Bridges High Court initiative, it's never really been determined exactly who was behind that. It's assumed to be domestic political actors who are benefiting, who wanted that initiative to be upheld that was struck down by the High Court. But because these groups or these individuals have paid for disinformation campaigns through M-Pesa, which is an online payment platform in Kenya. And then they have, it seems pretty clear, they've paid to rent users' accounts. So they're using real accounts, they're not creating fake pages, but they're finding influencers, paying them to use their accounts to then spread this kind of disinformation. So again, blurring the line between what is inauthentic content or not. So that brings us to the impact of all of these 50 campaigns, the millions of posts that they have pumped into Africa's information environments, the millions of times they've been liked. And again, you can go through this column where we try to pull out some of these figures just to show this impact in a quantitative sense. So for example, the 2018 campaigns that I have referenced several times that were tied to the Wagner Group in Russia, those inauthentic pages posted 48,000 times and received more than 9.7 million interactions, were liked by over 1.7 million accounts. So this is definitely reaching a lot of people. This is getting into the information environment. More and more people, especially in Africa, are getting their news online or getting their news through Facebook. There's always an anecdote I tell from Nigeria that people I met there, one of my friends in the house that I was staying with, she had a cell phone and had a smartphone, but her idea of the internet was Facebook. That was synonymous. To her, the internet meant Facebook, and that would be that she would use. And that's where her information came from, whoever she was following, whatever post she was seeing. So we can look at how many times all of these pages have posted, how many times they've been liked, but then the $1 million question is, what impact does that actually having on politics and societies? And there it's more anecdotal, it's more these bigger trends we're seeing. And one of those is the number of these online movements to bring the Wagner Group to countries like Mali, to the DRC, to Burkina Faso, to Niger, so countries in the Sahel where there is a real security challenge, especially with terrorist groups, with violence between farmers and herders, and with places where there is a need for a greater security presence. But the track record of these Wagner Group mercenaries is very clear. They've committed human rights abuses in the Central African Republic, in Libya, and these are really documented cases. But so where are these movements coming from to now bring them to other countries? Where is these movements coming from to support military juntas again, to suppress democratic transitions? Is this authentic social movements, or is something else happening? And really, I think the evidence points pretty clearly that something else is happening, that this isn't just anti-French sentiment finally boiling over. That's been a reality in these countries for decades, since the end of colonialism. But it's really seems to have been fomented and put into action by these large and sophisticated disinformation campaigns in somewhere like Mali, in Burkina Faso, where we know that Russia is investing a lot of time, a lot of efforts into these kind of training, sponsoring of influencers to kind of spread these messages online, to organize protest. We can get more into this in the Q&A and the conversation, but it's one of the areas where really we need more information. As I said, these campaigns that we documented are probably only the tip of the iceberg. It's by no means a finite list. So jumping to point number 2 is that there needs to be more research capacity in Africa, in African countries, for detecting and documenting these campaigns and understanding how they work, understanding their impact on specific countries. Before we even think about curbing or mitigating their impact, we really have to understand them better. Going back to the researcher from Libya, who I've worked closely with, there's no institution, there's no group within Libya that has funding to research disinformation in Libya. So an entire country is dependent on researchers in the United States, in Europe, in other parts of Africa, working with Facebook to get the information on disinformation there, to analyze it, and then to come up with policy responses. So that's a problem. So that's a first step, I think, is just building this capacity for research, and for putting pressure on social media companies to release this data, to be transparent about what they're seeing on their social networks, and then to work with them to reform how they treat social media or treat disinformation in Africa. So on that point, there really hasn't been much attention to monitoring and removing networks in Africa. It wasn't until it's usually been different research organizations or individuals blowing the whistle when these kind of unusual patterns are detected, and then taking it to Facebook saying, hey, we noticed this, can we look into this? And that's where a lot of these detected and documented cases come from. Some Facebook or Twitter have flagged on their own, but really the vast majority of their disinformation budgets, their efforts to curb this kind of coordinated inauthentic behavior, is devoted to the United States and Europe. And so there are real challenges that come with trying to monitor this massive amount of information and remove it, but those efforts really aren't even being attempted in a majority of African countries. So that needs to change. And then, jumping back to this first point about the need for more fact checking, that's absolutely an area where that can help, that there needs to be more good information sites where people can go for country specific information to find out what's really happening, and to debunk some of these false narratives that are being spread. But I think what we've learned over the last few years is that there's also limits to this. Once mistrust reaches a certain point, People are so siloed, like the example of Libya, where unless the fact-checking site, unless they know the creators of it, unless they assume that it's part of their region or their ethnicity, they don't trust it. And then we've seen this has really been a clear-cut attempt to weaponize fact-checking, to create alternative fact-checking sites that fact-check the fact-checkers. So fact-checking gets thrown around a lot as a solution, but there are limits there, and really more attention needs to be paid to the research capacity in Africa, and then to working with social media companies and pressuring them, passing legislation around how their platforms work, how they advance democratic dialogue, how they don't amplify content, especially in countries that are going through a democratic transition, that are trying to spread these anti-communication tactics to derail those processes. So these are all areas that are very early stages in Africa. Policy is really still trying to wrap its head around these issues. We could really be at the beginning of the curve, and disinformation in Africa could really get much worse, I think, before it gets better. So that's not the most optimistic note to end on, but I'm really looking forward to talking with you all, hearing your ideas, hearing kind of your thoughts on what can be done, especially on the technical side, and ideas for starting to mitigate and turn the tide against some of these campaigns that are having such a disruptive impact. So final slide, this is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. And again, I look forward to speaking to you all in a few weeks.
Thank you all for joining us. I know our participants are looking forward to live Q&A with you during the Institute in June. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.